Hello everyone, this is Dr. Miller. I am covering Chapter 3 for HR in the news this week. We are going to be looking at the equal employment opportunity and an article that discusses how the Me Too movement exposes the failure of HR. Chapter 3 provides an overview of the ways our governmental bodies regulate equal employment opportunity and workplace safety and health. It introduces the major laws affecting employers in these areas as well as the agencies charged with enforcing those laws. For instance, the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, is the agency charged with enforcing EEO laws. The text also discusses ways organizations can develop practices that ensure they are compliant with the law. However, this focus on compliance with the law is what the author of the article argues is what exposes the failure of HR. So we're going to cover a few things. First, we're going to discuss the learning objective that specifically highlights sexual harassment, and that's learning objective 3.5. So we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about the business's role, the organization's role in equal employment opportunity, HR's place within the Me Too movement. We're going to also discuss some historical details about the Anita Hill versus Clarence Thomas case. And then we're going to end with the future challenges and opportunities. So learning objective 3.5 first defines sexual harassment. And this definition comes from the EOC. They define it as unwelcome sexual advances. These unwelcome advances or requests for sexual favors in any other verbal or physical contact is considered sexual harassment when a victim's submission to the conduct is a condition of employment or a basis for employment decisions, and that's where we get into quid pro quo. It also becomes sexual harassment when the conduct interferes with the employee's work performance, thus creating a hostile work environment. The second part of learning objective 3.5 is to tell employers how they can eliminate or minimize the threats of sexual harassment. A few ideas that they mention are developing policy and communicating policy that defines what sexual harassment is, not only from the law, but also the organization's stance on it, thus, like you see here, forbidding sexual harassment, and then training employees on how to recognize and avoid this kind of behavior. The idea here is maybe some of these offenders aren't aware that their behavior is considered to be harassment. And then also provide a means for employees to actually complain about harassment and to be protected from the potential repercussions from their complaints. So the EEOC is responsible for enforcing most EEO laws. It investigates and resolves complaints. It gathers information and issues guidelines to organizations as well as to victims. The sexual harassment is a form of sex discrimination, and it violates the Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Title VII applies to employers with 15 or more employees, and this includes state and local government as well as federal government. It also includes employment agencies and labor organizations. But although legally this is applying to employers with 15 or more people, no company should be passive or submissive in sexual harassment. Sexual harassment is considered to be unlawful under Title VII when a person is being harassed because of their sex. And sexual harassment can actually occur in a variety of circumstances. The victim as well as the harasser can be a woman or a man. The victim doesn't have to be of the opposite sex. It can actually be, harassment can actually be considered from same-sex offenders. The harasser can be the victim's supervisor, an agent of the employer, a supervisor in another area, a coworker, or even a non-employee. And the victim doesn't even have to be the one being harassed, but it could be anyone affected by said offensive conduct. The other qualifier of what harassment is that it must be unwelcome. Harassment does not have to necessarily be of a sexual nature. It can also include offensive remarks about a person's sex. NBC Learn partnered with Caitlin to do a think piece on this, discussing briefly her article about her concerns with HR in the middle of the Me Too movement. I highly encourage you to go and view it. I would say the written article is more thorough because when you see the title, it's pretty sensational because it assumes, or it allows you to assume, that the whole problem with the Me Too movement has something to do with HR. But actually, in the article, she goes into further detail about how we have to look at the barrel, we have to look at the system, we have to look at leadership and the culture and the climate and understand what HR's role is and how they were in the middle of the whole Me Too movement, but how HR is not the department or solely responsible for sexual harassment. So as you heard, she mentioned about Anita Hill, the situation with Anita Hill, the watershed event that happened about 30 years ago. So a lot of employers put their trust into HR as the mechanism that they can use and depend on to prevent, police, and investigate sexual harassment. Even the Equal Opportunity Employment Commission, the EEOC, would direct Americans to their HR offices if they were experiencing harassment. So the Me Too movement her concern here in her article that she wrote and what she was saying is that the fact that the Me Too movement kept turning up these shocking, horrible stories at respectful or respected places of employment, it was an issue, and it caused her to do this piece to reflect on whether or not HR had failed to do their job, or was this failure really even on HR? So another thing that she mentioned in the article was how most of the females who experience sexual harassment, most of the employees that experience sexual harassment are women. However, it is not just women that experience sexual harassment. Men also experience sexual harassment. Another thing that she pointed out was that the majority of HR professionals are about 75% women. So she was actually shocked that with all these women there, that they were kind, they were inviting, they were very personable and really cared about their job. And there was a panel at this conference, at this Work Human conference that was in Austin, and there was a panel with the founder of the Me Too movement, Ashley Judd, Adam Grant, and then Ronan, who actually broke the story about Harvey Weinstein in the New Yorker. So they had all these people there, but when they discussed the issues relating to the Me Too movement, she said that they appeared disinterested. On one hand, they were inspired, and then on the other hand, they didn't seem to have any sense of responsibility that have allowed the harassment to flourish. That's her words exactly. So Ronan Farrow, he quotes, "The Me Too was about the elaborate systems in place that could be utilized by the most powerful, wealthiest men." And then Adam Grant follows up by saying, "Reporting systems and companies tend not to work very well. The problem of sexual harassment wasn't merely one of bad apples, but also of bad barrels." So in this analogy, at least when I read it, I think that he's saying it's not just the people who are behaving badly, but it's the system that's enabled or allowed this to go unpunished. However, Caitlin, she says in this analogy, the harassing men were the apples, and that the systems to protect them, such as HR, were the bad barrels. And so that's why I pose this question. Is HR the bad barrel, or could HR be considered as part of the bad barrel? And she said at that conference that everyone seemed so inspired, that she was so excited to be a part of, the answer to the failures of HR was more HR. Basically saying more training, more policy, more communication, more clarity around the issue of sexual harassment. So she didn't say this in the video, which I think is important to highlight. Like she wasn't just bashing the HR profession or the HR department. She said that the simple and unpalatable truth is that HR isn't bad at dealing with sexual harassment. HR is actually very good at it. The HR profession and the HR profession are very good at handing out or doing what they need to do within their power. She also quotes, or I quote her, she says that in a strong job market, HR is the soul of generosity, making employees feel valued and significant. But should the economy change, HR can just as quickly become assassin as friend. Because some companies do put it they delegate it down to where HR is considered the hatchet person, the deliverer of bad news, the person who has to lay off the employees, when actually those are directive orders coming down from top management team. So she even says in her article, it's not here, Jane's not a bad person. She's carrying out orders from far up the ladder. And when it comes to sexual harassment, women, and I would insert and men, understand that Jane reports to upper management, not some neutral body that stands in allegiance with the right moral action. So basically what she's saying is that the HR professionals' hands are tied. And what HR is actually responsible for, what they're considered to be a value add to the company, is serving as the first line of defense against a sexual harassment lawsuit. And that's where she comes in to talk more about the issues with compliance, the issues with laws and policy. That what these things do is, instead of protecting the victim, they protect the company from liability. So I thought it was important to go back in history a little bit and discuss the impact of Anita Hill's testimony. Anita Hill, she was a law professor at the University of Oklahoma at the time, and she came forward with the accusations that Clarence Thomas, who was going through his hearings to be confirmed as a member of the Supreme Court, had harassed her. She worked for Clarence Thomas for years when he was the head of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which I think is pretty ironic that he was head of the EEOC, yet he was charged as being someone who was being the harasser, even though he was the person who was supposed to hand out the guidelines and do the investigative reports to protect victims from the potential of harassment. Anita Hill said that Justice Thomas had harassed her with inappropriate discussions of sexual acts and pornographic films, and this happened after she told him that she did not want to date him. So because she rejected him, this was his response in retaliation to her. Now, of course, he still went on to win the seat, his terminal position. The Senate voted 52 to 48 to confirm him as a justice on the Supreme Court. So it may have looked like, oh, this is a win for him and not for justice for those who did believe Anita Hill. However, society and organizations took that as a clue or as a cue to do something about the problem. It shed light on the fact that sexual harassment does happen in the workplace, even in the places like the EEOC where you would imagine that it wouldn't happen. So since that time, so that was 1991, and since that time, the EEOC said that the sexual harassment cases had doubled, and the sanctions and the ramifications, the financial ramifications had quadrupled from about 7.7 million all the way up to 27.8 million. Some would argue that this caught the attention of businesses and companies. Is like, oh, we need to make sure that because of this and because of this attention and because of the empowerment and willingness of people to come forward about sexual harassment, that we start to see more instructional films, more training modules, more seminars, and more explicit policies condemning sexual harassment. In the article, Flanagan also states that Me Too was inevitable because over this time period, there was just this anger about harassment that was continuing to happen. And then there was frustration about the system that wasn't protecting the victims, or the system that had been created to address it wasn't doing what the job needed to do. So in 2017, there were 3 prominent American women who spoke out very publicly against HR departments. One such person was Susan Fowler. She was the engineer from Uber who detailed the sexual harassment that she experienced in the company. Then there was Nancy Erica Smith. She was the person who represented Gretchen Carlson at Fox News, stating HR is not your friend, HR will not help you. And then Anita Hill also chimed in during this time, stating that there are still companies that'll pay lip service to human resources departments while quietly allowing women to be vilified when they come forward. And I will say, even recently when I went to YouTube to look at the video, there were more people who disliked the video from Caitlin Flanagan, and lots of very angry and negative comments. And so I think it's important to say, even though with Caitlin Flanagan, her concern, her research, her focus, her body of work focuses on women issues, she would also say, or the law also states, that this isn't just a woman issue. This is a man's issue as well. And if a woman is coming forward to complain or to express concern about sexual harassment, it's not necessarily an attack on all men, but just an attack on one person who is engaged in this behavior and creating a hostile work environment. So even before that time period, before the whole Me Too movement started and we started to hear more reports about Harvey Weinstein, the EEOC developed a task force in 2016, a sexual harassment task force. And what they found was that there's much of the training that had been done over the past 30 years has not worked as a preventative tool. So it's interesting because this is supposed to work. If people are educated, if people are aware, if they're trained, then we shouldn't see these heightened incidences of sexual harassment. What they found instead in their study is that sexual harassment was widespread and persistent because 85% of the workers who were harassed, they never reported. And the reasons why these employees didn't report sexual harassment is because they didn't feel like they would be believed. It would be a he said, she said, and they also feared repercussions, losing their jobs. So instead, they were more than likely to come up with their own solutions, such as just avoiding the harasser, maybe downplaying it, trying to reframe it as something else, or just simply enduring it, which is sad. And I would say even some people left the company to try to find a scenario in which they were no longer They were no longer feeling threatened. So there were some solutions identified from the EEOC task force, such as just more training, right? So, but there was no evidence. The caveat here, like, we train people, but there's no evidence that training actually affects the frequency of sexual harassment experienced by the women in the workplace. Also, what Flanagan has said in her video is that these trainings actually provided a blueprint for would-be harassers to know how to make sure that they protect themselves. The other issue with the training is that employees felt like these, and not just employees, but the task force felt like the HR training and procedures were more focused on protecting the employer from liability instead of focusing on ending the problem, or even focus on protecting the employee and allowing he or she to have a safe work environment. Another possible solution that the task force mentioned was implementing the It's On Us campaign in the workplace. So It's On Us was a campaign directed towards college campuses to try to reduce instances of sexual assault. However, there was no evidence that the campaign did anything, and after a while, there was no more buzz about it, and the initiative had largely been forgotten. And then the other training that they mentioned was the bystander intervention training and civility training. Like, just in general, civility training, not just on not being someone who's engaging in harassment, but being a kind and courteous person and what that can look like in an organization. Bystander intervention, the whole idea behind that is that many people, and we see that in today and how we engage with social media, people can see someone being assaulted on the street, and instead of doing anything to try to help the victim, they pull up their phones. So basically, bystander intervention training is to empower others if they are witnessing behavior that should not be tolerated, that they are empowered to say something about it. So why has HR accomplished so little in the space of sexual harassment? They don't have the power. They can deliver the trainings, they can write the policies, they can craft reports, develop and conduct investigations. But if the person is a person of high status, nothing will be done. There's a sense of privilege that and protection that, depending on somebody's position within a company, that they may be protected from these kinds of things. Now, if the harasser is of low status within the organization, then sure, yes, HR can do something. They can proceed with a plan of action so that a harasser is put to justice or terminated or after a thorough investigation. And I can honestly say, in my experience as an HR professional, I do remember coming across someone when we were doing some workforce planning and trying to understand why one leader in a particular organization had several employees under him and another person had not one person reporting to him. It just didn't make sense. There was no true division of labor. And when I brought that question up, they said, well, it's just best that no one reports to him. He's in more of a technical role. I'm like, well, this other leader is also in a technical role. So this just doesn't make sense. Why are we workforce planning to bring in potentially more managers when we have someone here who should be able to manage someone else? And my director said, you know, some things are kind of above your pay grade, so just let it go. Oh, okay. You can read between the lines to know that this person had created a hostile environment before, but this person's skill set was so unique and so valuable within the company that they were willing to put up with him, but to protect the person and any other potential victim, they just decided to make sure he didn't have anyone report to him. So if the harasser is important to the company, the case can be quickly whisked out of HR's hands and the investigation delivered to the lawyers and the final decision being rendered by the executives, such as in the example that I just gave you. So in this regard, executives are no longer under any legal imperative to terminate the harasser or to even enforce any kind of sanction, just to make sure that the victim who made the report feels safe in the future. So even in the situation that I described, the victim was made to feel safe. That person no longer had to report to the alleged offender, and that is the legal imperative that exists. So within the context of the Me Too movement, in the early and middle phases of it, it was good for business. Organizational leaders were speaking out. They were seen as, this is no nonsense, we're not going to tolerate this, and it was great. It was great for the sense of building a corporation's reputation and this idea of some social responsibility. However, to date, we don't hear as much anymore about issues of sexual harassment. Because this was built on kind of a movement, a social change, and there's a cycle. There's a cycle, and it's destined to fade when it becomes less fashionable, when people are paying less and less attention. So the number of famous men being fired has slowed. And then also there was a backlash against the movement as well. And because of this backlash, the Me Too movement has been quieted, because there are some people who perceive some of the punishment for alleged offenders to be unfair and unwarranted. And in some cases, it may be rightly so. It may be that some people are trying to take advantage of an opportunity and a visibility and are making claims that are false or just untrue. However, it does not negate the fact that sexual harassment still happens, and these cases should not be ignored and should be investigated if someone does report a concern. And brought up some possible solutions. She stated that she talked with several people just to try to understand really what could be done. One major solution, a credible solution, is a change in organizational climate and culture. One in which the ethical fabric of the organization is upheld and implemented and reinforced first by leadership. So leadership are the ones who must create this healthy climate, create this culture that establishes that harassment will not be tolerated and will be punished severely. This messaging shouldn't just come from the HR department. It should not just come from the middle managers. The middle managers can't change the culture of a company, but the leaders of the company can. They have the power, they have the influence, the credibility, and the visibility. Expecting an HR manager to risk their job to fight against management on behalf of an employee that they may not even know or have any or owe anything to is just unrealistic. Another potential solution that Flanagan identified was training executives through aggressive tactics. So she described one attorney that she met who would come and talk to executives, and he would be very aggressive and tell them that he's there so that their company doesn't have to hire someone like them to come and destroy their careers. Another point that this person made, he told them, if you're such a hotshot, why do you? No, this is what if you're such a stud, why do you only date women who depend on you for employment? Why can't you walk outside of this building and find someone else to date? So his approach was considered to be unconventional, but it was also effective. However, it's not widespread. It's not become mainstream. It may be something very costly to implement, so many companies have not adopted this approach. Another solution that we've seen is these love contracts. So these love contracts is basically where employees have to sign a contract that states who they're dating, report this to HR, and affirm that they are willingly taking part in a consensual relationship. So I guess so there's no backlash against the company should things go wrong. So this just doesn't feel like this should be HR's role in these love contracts. Flanagan describes this as a reverse engineering from employment law, where Title VII is the Bible, compliance training is the sermon, and the HR office is the confessional. But really, that shouldn't be HR's role. So in conclusion, provided a definition of the EEOC as well as sexual harassment, which is this unwanted sexual advancements and conduct that creates a hostile environment for the employees. We also discussed the role of HR. I described exactly what HR's responsibilities are and their responsivity to the organizations. HR does have a balancing act to play. They are there to support the organization and help craft policies and environments that makes it a healthy place for employees to be. And then their role is also to be there to champion the employee's voice as well. So they have this balancing act that they have to play. However, it is not the sole responsibility of HR to be a single department to combat sexual harassment. This is something that has societal implications, which is why we did see the huge rise of this social movement that says this must stop. And it also is about the climate and culture of the organization. And if a change needs to come, then it must come from the top. So I leave you with a couple of discussion questions. I found this meme that says, if Anita Hill and Clarence Thomas squared off today, Thomas would be consigned to the trash bin of history. I would like to know, what are your thoughts about this meme? What do you think that this meme suggests? And do you agree or disagree with what the meme is suggesting? And then my next question. The Me Too movement is now past tense after the backlash and the natural cycle of a social movement. However, sexual harassment is still an unlawful concern, both for men and for women in the workplace. So in your opinion, and I'd love to see your opinion also based and supported through what you're reading in the textbook, or even maybe some external resources, what can HR do to promote a safe work environment that's free from sexual harassment? Thank you for your attention today.